The silk was cold against my skin. Not the soft, warm cotton my mother used to wrap around my shoulders on Harmattan mornings. This was different. Foreign. A fabric that didn't know me. I stood in the center of a room that cost more than my entire village, and the most dangerous man in Seoul stood 10 feet away with his back to me, completely unbothered. They told me he would destroy me. They told me a girl like me, Adaeze Okafor, daughter of a cassava farmer from Enugu, would not survive one night under his roof. But here's what nobody told me. He never touched me. And somehow, that was the most terrifying thing of all. My name is Adaeze. In Igbo, it means daughter of a king. My mother used to say that with her chest out, stirring egusi soup at 5 in the morning, her wrapper tied tight around her waist like armor. You carry royal blood, in WAM. Never forget that. I never forgot. But royal blood doesn't pay debt. My father, the most brilliant, most stubborn, most heartbreakingly hopeful man I have ever known, borrowed money 3 years ago to expand his textile business. He had a vision. Fabric imported from South Korea, sold across West Africa. A bridge between two worlds. The man he borrowed from wasn't a bank. He was a ghost. A name spoken only in whispers. A name that made immigration officers look the other way and made police chiefs suddenly lose their memory. Park J1. When the business collapsed, when the shipment was seized at the port and my father's partner vanished with the remaining capital, the debt didn't disappear. It compounded. I found my mother sitting on the kitchen floor the night the men came. Not crying. My mother never cried. She was holding a piece of osso oak fabric, burnt orange and gold, the one she'd saved for my wedding, just holding it. They want one of us, she whispered. I didn't ask which one. I already knew. Asterisk, tell me. Would you have done what I did? Would you have walked into that darkness to save the people you loved? Or would you have run? Asterisk. I didn't run. They flew me to Seoul on a private plane that had no airline logo. A woman named Mrs. Cho met me at the door of a building that looked like a luxury hotel, but felt like a fortress. She handed me a robe, spoke to me in perfect English, and told me exactly 3 things. 1. I was to be a companion. Nothing more was explained. 2. I was not to ask questions. 3. Mr. Park did not like to be looked at directly. I looked him directly in the eyes the moment I walked into that room. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was my mother's voice in my head. You carry royal blood. Maybe it was just stubbornness. Maybe I wanted him to see that whatever I was not broken. Park J1 sat at the head of a long marble table, a single glass of whiskey in front of him, files spread open like a general reviewing battle plans. He was younger than I expected. Sharper. His jaw was set like a man who hadn't smiled in years and had no plans to start. He looked up. Our eyes met. He held my gaze for exactly 4 seconds. I counted, and then he did something I did not expect from the most feared man in East Asia's criminal underworld. He looked away. Leave us, he said quietly to Mrs. Cho. And then, without looking at me again, he said, asterisk, sit down, Miss Okafor. You look like you haven't eaten since Lagos. Asterisk. He fed me. That was the first strange thing. A full meal appeared. Rice, braised short rib, banchan arranged in perfect small dishes, and he simply returned to his files while I sat across a table wide enough to park a car on, eating alone. He didn't speak to me for 40 minutes. I watched him. I couldn't help it. His hands moved precisely over documents, signing, dismissing, occasionally making a single phone call in Korean so low I could barely hear it. Whatever he said in those calls, the energy in the room shifted. Like a barometric pressure drop before a storm. This was a man people were afraid of. And yet he'd ordered me dinner. You studied economics, he said suddenly, without looking up. My fork stopped midair. How do you know that? University of Lagos. First-class honors. Thesis on informal trade networks in West Africa. He turned a page. I read everything before I make acquisitions. Acquisitions? That word landed like a stone in still water. Is that what I am? I asked. My voice was steadier than I felt. An acquisition? He finally looked up. Those dark eyes moved over my face with the same focused calm he gave his documents. You're an arrangement, he said, to settle a debt. And what does the arrangement require of me? The silence that followed was the longest of my life. Nothing, he said. For now. For now. 2 words that should have comforted me. 2 words that somehow kept me awake until 3 in the morning staring at a ceiling in the most beautiful bedroom I'd ever slept in, wondering what they truly meant. The room they gave me was separated from his by a long hallway and 2 locked doors. I know because I counted my steps at midnight like a woman mapping her own prison. On the 3rd day, I heard him playing piano. I didn't know why that undid something in me. This man, who people said had buried his enemies in the Yellow Sea, was playing Chopin at midnight in a darkened room, alone. I stood outside the door and listened until my feet went cold on the marble floor. Ask yourself this. If you heard that music, would you have knocked on the door or walked away? I walked away, but I came back the next night, and the night after that. On the 7th day, Mrs. Cho found me in the library and placed a folder on the table in front of me. Inside was my father's debt agreement, and next to the original signature was mine. My signature, on a document I had never seen, transferring not just debt settlement, but legal guardianship, a term so buried in financial language it had taken me a moment to understand what I was reading. He didn't buy you to punish your family, Mrs. Cho said quietly. I looked up at her. He bought your contract to keep someone else from taking you. The folder shook in my hands. What do you mean? There was another buyer, Miss Okafor. Her voice dropped. One who would not have been so, considerate. The room tilted. Park Jae-won, the man with cold eyes and Chopin in the dark, had not acquired me as a prize. He had acquired me as protection. But from whom? And why? Why would one of the most powerful men in Seoul's underworld spend that kind of capital shielding a girl from Enugu he had never met? I confronted him that evening. He was on the rooftop terrace, the Seoul skyline glittering behind him like spilled jewelry. He didn't turn around when I stepped outside. He already knew I was there. You could have told me, I said. Would you have believed me? I opened my mouth, closed it. Sit down, Adaeze. It was the first time he'd used my name. Not Miss Okafor, not the arrangement, my name, and the way it sounded in his voice, careful and deliberate, like he'd practiced the pronunciation, cracked something open in my chest that I immediately tried to seal back up. I sat. We stayed in silence for a long time, the city breathing below us. My father had a deal with your father, he said finally. 15 years ago, before I took over, before everything. He paused. Your father was the only business partner who ever treated my father like a man and not a weapon. I thought about my father, his laugh, his stubbornness, his impossible, dangerous hope. He never told me. I whispered. He didn't know the connection. Jae-won turned to look at me then, and for the first time, the controlled coldness in his face had a hairline fracture in it. Something human behind the armor. But I knew the moment I saw the debt file whose daughter you were. My throat tightened. So what am I to you? Obligation? Repayment? He looked at me for a long, still moment. I don't know yet, he said honestly. And somehow that honesty, raw and unpolished from a man who dealt in carefully constructed power, was more intimate than anything else he could have said. That night, I dreamed of my mother's egusi soup and woke up crying. Not from fear. From something I didn't have a name for yet. Everything shifted after the rooftop. Not dramatically, not in the way of romance novels where the world suddenly blooms. It was quieter than that. More dangerous. He began leaving books on the library table he knew I'd been reading. I began timing my midnight walks to pass the piano room. We began having dinner together, still mostly in silence, but a different kind of silence. A chosen one. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself I was a practical woman. Adaeze Okafor from Enugu. Grounded. Sensible. And then his second in command, a man named Director Lem, looked at me across a room full of people and smiled in a way that made every hair on my body stand up. Be careful, Jae-won said quietly beside me, his voice so low only I could hear. He's been asking about you. The silence was absolute. And that was the moment everything changed. Because what I discovered next, I was never supposed to know. Part 2 is coming. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the truth about why he's really been watching will change everything you think you know about this story.